according to you. It's all about the efficiency for me.
Exactly.
How much
pretty prolific.
Yeah, well, tell me a little bit about yourself, Darren. I got some stuff from the emails, but just for those who, if we post this, those who haven't read the emails, which I assume is probably
everyone, I hope. I was going to start with kind of how you get from studying astrophysics to meeting God, which is kind of my journey.
That sounds very interesting.
Yeah, like my church background is pretty much zero. I was born in England, and it's a pretty secular place. So my parents, there was no church for my parents. There was no church for me. I learned like the Lord's Prayer at school, and that was about the extent of it. Okay. So then you move on to university, and a science subject is pretty heavy. So there's no church there, the opposite, in fact. My wife, we moved to Canada. She's pursuing a PhD there. So we completed that, and then on to America for employment.
Okay.
So our lives are pretty much, on a great trajectory. Without God, we're doing fine. Mm-hmm. And we've been in town 2 months. We don't know anyone. And she says, hey, you want to go on a hike? And I'm like, well, no. Of course not. But there's a little voice inside me that usually steers me the right way. And it's like, say yes. So I'm like, okay. And we go out with our little 9-year-old daughter for this hike. And it's like 5 in the evening in the end of February. So it's starting to get dark halfway around. And we hear a group coming up behind us. It's a couple and their friend. My wife's got a thick English accent. My daughter's cute and loud. So they quickly latch onto us. This happens a lot. We complete the hike with these guys. And then they hand us a card and they say, we're planting a church. And I have no idea what that means. I know what church means. So I'm a little wary. But we're doing a new church plant. We've only been here a year. And that voice is there again. It's like, she's going to ask you to go. I'm like, I know. I'm not. And it's like, no, you are. I quickly think it through. I'm like, okay. It's an argument immediately if I say no. But if I say yes, I know what will happen. We'll go. These people will be intolerable and we'll hate it. And they'll say crazy things and it'll be terrible. And then they'll demand some money and then we're free. I have this horrible PR with the church. Like, this is what will happen, right? In my ignorance. So we do go. We show up and, people are kind of polite and nice. They don't really interact. It's small. It's like 30 people at the most. And they get a guitar out and they do some kind of contemporary sounding music with Jesus and God in it, which is I'd never heard before. Not my thing. So this is all a little weird. And then your pastor starts talking some Bible stuff. It's kind of quiet. And then the strangest thing happens. I start to feel oddly emotional. And I understand it. I'm not prone to this kind of thing. He's not saying anything emotional. I get this overwhelming sense of belonging or being at home or something. And I get a little scared. The rational part of my brain's like, this isn't right. You're going crazy. I kind of glance across at my wife. And she's like, I see tears in her eyes. I'm like, something strange is going on here. And we get out and she's like, I think we should go back next week. I'm like, yeah, so do I. See if this thing happens. I'm like, maybe I should check out this Bible thing as well. Having never opened one. So I got a Bible. I just kind of opened it up. I think it was Matthew or something. I started reading and was blown away. I was like, this is the instruction manual for life. Why have I never been given this before? Like, it's telling me how to interact with people in a very productive way. Now, I'd been involved with Peterson from the summer before, right before the pronouns from Maps of Meaning. And it was 2 months before his biblical stuff. But, Peterson had been an influence. And this was trying something new. And I'm like expanding my borders.
Yeah.
So we went back. I read some Bible and I met with a pastor. We read some more Bible. But my thing is the culture shock from the astrophysics and stuff into the church where science is its enemy. And I fear many people who come through Peterson's biblical talks and then actually enter a physical church thinking it's going to be this great environment. It might not be.
Yep.
Yeah. So my main thing was small groups. I went to a small group, and they were doing the story of Jesus sends the disciples off ahead, and they're in a boat. They get tossed around in the storm, and then he wanders out across the water. And I'm thinking, that's a great story. You know, the water represents this chaos, and there's these people in a boat, and Jesus is untouched by the chaos. And he's just stood there, unaffected. And then Peter's like, can I do this? And Jesus is like, if you keep your eye on me, you'll be fine. And he does it. He's unaffected by the chaos because of what he's doing. Then he slips and he starts to sink and he gets a telling off. So I relay my understanding of the story that way, thinking, whoa, this is really useful for my life. And I get a table of blank stares. I'm like, no, he walked on the water. I'm like, I don't know what to do. I was expecting like, oh, this is really good. We can live our life this way.
If the people in your group had read something like this, which is basically, this is a commentary, unlike all the rest of my commentaries, which is a compilation from sermons and writings of ancient church fathers. What you just described isn't exactly, but you can get there from here.
Yeah.
You have a harder time getting there from a lot of this other stuff. There's real stuff going on here. Keep talking. Sorry to interrupt. That was probably a bad move on my part.
Oh, no, it's perfect. We were trying to make friends here, so I held back a little bit from trying to insult anyone. But we had a couple over for dinner, getting to know them. It's going fine. And then one of them says, can you believe people actually think evolution is real? And I don't know how to cope. I just kind of laugh and nod. But once they found out I was more science-based, then they start flooding me with books that are clearly going to change my mind. So there's books by like Cahill and Young Earth types, and they're pretty bad books, but it's hard to, they're all like quote mined, and it's an argument from ignorance in many ways, because it's, you don't know what you don't know. That classic Rumsfeld thing, the unknown unknowns. They don't know what they don't know. So this guy says science is this, and they believe him. It's on authority. It's like, it's not like that at all. It's cherry picked, and all the quotes are ... a cool line that proves your point ... And I think they start at the conclusion and then find the evidence to fill in the gaps and then say, look, it works. Yeah. Just like mainstream media today with everyone's a Nazi, right? You start with he's a Nazi, and then Peterson, fill in the blanks, and
that's right.
Work this way.
Yeah, he's got all these Russian posters. That shows he's a Nazi.
Exactly.
It's like the test for a witch in Monty Python on the Holy Grail. She floats. She's a witch.
Well, that's just it.
She weighs as much as a duck. No, I know.
Yeah. So I've been approaching the Bible from a very it's kind of logic based, in that, of course, if I stop lying, my relationships improve with people.
Yeah. And
if I'm nice to people, they'll be nice back.
Yeah.
So I'm having this nice journey of logic.
Yeah.
But then I come up against faith, where reason and logic alone doesn't explain what God is. I don't want God to be a person, because that doesn't seem to fit. Like, he's described as a lot with emotions, and he gets angry. And I was like, I don't think that fits. I don't think God gets angry. I think you do things that increase the likelihood that you'll suffer terrible consequences when you stray from a biblical path.
Mm-hmm.
So being on the biblical path, my life gets better and better. And if I stray away, it gets worse.
Mm-hmm.
I was trying to explain my idea with the pastor, saying, if you get a stool and put it on top of a table, and then you spin around and dance on top of it, that makes gravity really angry. And gravity will throw you to the ground really fast when you do that. It's like, it's not gravity getting mad. You're just increasing the chances that you fall down. But it doesn't exhaust it. There's something else there. There's this whole synchronicity that I'm struggling to understand. Like, things happen. I saw a Peterson lecture where he says, when you orient yourself towards something, it's like looking at a map, and things on the map start to stand out, and then they stand out in reality. So if you have to turn left at the church, when you're going down that street, you see that church. Normally you wouldn't, you'd keep going. But that still doesn't exhaust the whole thing.
Yeah. Yeah.
So this week, God decides to test me, whatever God is, decides to test me. And my wife's driving to work, and a truck pulls out. And she almost hits it. She avoids it. She's shaken up. But on the back, it says Psalm 5:3. So she takes note. She gets to work and calls me, like, what is Psalm 5:3? I'm like, I have no idea. Are you looking it up?
I am looking it up right now. Psalm 5. No, pastors do not have the Bible fully memorized. In the morning, the Lord heard my voice. In the morning, I lay my request before you and wait expectantly. That's Psalm 5:3.
Yeah, so the next morning, that's what she did. She said, God, if you have something you want me to do today, she said, I want to do this prayer every day. If you've got something you want me to do today, I wait expectantly. And she went to work. And within an hour, she got a phone call out of the blue saying, are you guys able to host a foreign exchange student? And she calls me up, and I'm like, no, of course not.
Just like the walk. No,
yeah, no.
You're like me. You lead with no. Any change? No, I don't want it.
It's like, we don't have a spare bedroom. We have an office, but we don't have a spare bedroom, and we're moving in 6 months, and we don't want to buy more furniture. And I'm coming up with every reason no. And she's like, it's a God thing. I prayed this. God wants you to do it. I'm like, this is the first time I'm going to have to do something that I think is not reason or logical to do, but because God wanted me to do it. So it's a great test. I love the test because I'm failing it. I call up my old pastor, and I'm like, God wants me to do something I don't want to do. What do I do? And he's like, he'll stretch you. It's what he does. So just go with it. So that's what I had to do. I had to try and figure this out. My camera won't focus. Come on, camera. Nope. Doesn't want to focus.
That's okay. It'll probably come back into focus. Who knows?
If I stop moving so much, yeah. So I had to figure it out. Am I going to do? Because I'm living my life as if God is real, but He doesn't have to be real for me to do that, or for me to benefit from what seems to be happening. But this one is different. You're going to have to put yourself out or do something that you think is stupid.
You're going to have to get out of the boat into that water of chaos.
Exactly. So that's why I'm doing this conversation from my living room and not my office, because I passed the test. I'm like, okay. But there's a lot of evidence searching, like, has God let me down before when I followed any of this stuff? And no. But faith is a big leap from logic.
Yeah. I'm sorry I laugh. It's just too much fun.
He has a lot of fun. There's a lot of coincidences. And when these coincidences pop up, my wife points them out, and I'm like, I'm not even surprised anymore. There's just so much synchronicity, and I'm trying to logic it away. It's coincidence. It's coincidence.
Yeah.
It's still coincidence.
Yeah, you can play that game all day long. That's fine. You just play.
Within 2 years, he's got me.
Yeah. So what does that look like for you?
It's very happy. But, and we're taking on a burden. And I think Peterson's right when he says there's burden is where meaning is found.
Yeah.
And Jesus carries his big burden cross around. And but orienting myself towards God completely changed me, my personality, who I am. Fundamentally from the ground up. It's that whole thing about what you're aiming at changes the reality around you, because you evaluate the objects based on what you're trying to do. So a chair and a desk are great when you're sitting down at a desk, but if you want to cross a room, these become obstacles. And you don't like them anymore. So people before were, obstacles. But then with Jesus's teaching, you have to look at each one like each one was worthy enough that he would die for them. So that puts a lot of respect on each person. Because if he's willing to die for you, who am I to disrespect you? Like I have no place to do that. So it changes my personality. And then, like what I used to say was, if you asked me a year ago, are you a good guy? I would have said yes. You ask me now, are you a good guy? I'd be like, no, but I'm a lot better than I used to be.
I know the selfish jerk I am now.
Yeah, it's very obvious. How self-focused you are is you're blind to that. I see that religion requires quite a lot of self-awareness. And I don't see that as a particularly common trait. So how do you teach people to be self-aware?
You can't talk them into it. And this is why what you're essentially talking about is conversion. I mean, that's the Christian word for it. You've had a conversion experience. No one, the irony is that it begins with a walk, but that walk began with a little voice. And I can't tell you how many people tell me stories like this regularly. And so all of the church planters and missionaries and earnest Christians out there are trying to figure out how to bottle this and program it. No. You're going to program that little voice in you that sent you on that walk, that had you... No. That has your wife with a thick English accent and your cute little girl and the church planters just there, and they pull out the guitar and you think, ugh. But they talk and it's like weird. And then you've been looking at Peterson, and then you read the story of Jesus walking on the water, and you're like, oh, I know what this is about. You've got a boat, you've got a storm on the sea, you've got Jesus walking, and Peter this just interprets itself.
So that's what I wanted to do for this church. I was like, there's lots of me's out there. And they don't realize it yet, but they need this. So how do you do it?
Well, but here's the funny thing. If you now were to talk to you 4 years ago, you wouldn't believe the you now. You'd say, if you could send a tape back in time and say, now listen to me. And movies play on this kind of stuff all the time, obviously. But, and that's why, again, part of Christian tradition is that this is God's work, and God does this in us. And that really then will start to mess with your mind, because it'd be like, well, God, why did God wait until now and not 5 years ago? Why is God doing this to me and not these other people over here? And then suddenly the idea of a personal God, a God who is making choices, a God who the best way we can imagine him is in a personal way. Well, suddenly that whole strain of the Bible and Christianity begins to make sense too. But it's also, the problems don't go away, because it's also rather offensive. So I like to use the example of the Apostle Paul in the book of Acts. The Apostle Paul is hunting down Christians in order to persecute or maybe even kill them, have them killed. This is what he's doing. and then there's the road to Damascus. Now, what would you say to the families of those Christians who had been hunted down before the road to Damascus of why God chose the timing he did?
Yeah.
Because, and it's like, you can't, there's no answering these questions. And the only way you can finally resolve it is saying, he is God and I am not.
That's where I kind of got to, was that's not your job.
Yeah.
That's my job.
Yeah.
I'll do it. You just don't get in the way.
Yeah.
I'm like, I can do that.
Yeah. And if in fact, this is what I always tell people, don't play chicken with God. Well, what do you mean by that? This is not the kind of being you really want to imagine you can manipulate or control or schmooze or bribe or anything like that. That once you have a sense of who and what God is, those kinds of things become really bad ideas. Really bad ideas. And Peterson says this in some different ways, but the point is the same, that once you begin to become aware that maybe the world isn't quite as flat, and you don't have the amount of power and control over the world, much less yourself, that you thought you did, you decide to work your life in a different way.
Yeah, I spent a long time, I was my God. You play God in your own life, and I was terrible at it. I didn't know the future. I didn't know where I needed to be, what hike I needed to be on.
That's right.
I didn't know any of that stuff. So I'm just floundering around, reacting to things.
Yeah. But your observations about the church are really important, and they're really difficult so then you think, well, I'm going to tell church leaders what this is like, and then maybe they can change things. And what you begin to discover is that that's not so easily done. Because, okay, so what would you do? And I mean, the question of music is a terrific example, because about 30 years ago, whole groups of Christian churches in the West changed their musical style and tradition radically in order to be more mission focused and capable. And kind of works, sort of works, doesn't work. All of these, we sit down and we think, well, I'll just rearrange something so that it will work. But that's kind of how we got in this mess in the first place. So it's really hard, but it's at the same time really helpful for people like yourself who have had the kind of transition you had to share your experience, because we might not know what to do about it, but we do kind of learn from it. I don't know if that makes sense.
It does. It's the biggest culture shock I've had. Like, I moved from England to Canada, and that was a surprising culture shock considering the language was the same. Everything else was different. And then Canada to the US, there's still a culture shock, because there's things that are ingrained in children, when you're young, through growing up, and cultural references that I'm completely alien to. Yeah. And habits. But when I went into the church from outside the church, the culture shock was enormous.
Well, talk about that. Say more about that.
Well, it's just, I guess they're believing entirely on faith and with little evidence to back it up. There's a lot of, because the Bible says so. And my point, I'm like, okay, so your evidence is the Bible. So now I need to know what the Bible is. So who wrote it? And then I run into a wall there straight away. It's like, well, we don't know. We think this guy wrote this bit, but then we think this guy wrote that bit. So I'm like, if you're basing it on the Bible, and I can't verify solidly who wrote any of this stuff or what their motive was. And then you run into this question of, did Rome conquer the church, or did the church conquer Rome? In which case you've got a good motive for changing what's in the Bible. But reading it, I think the best thing I heard was the Bible isn't the truth, but it contains the truth.
Okay.
And the messages are there. The lessons are still in there. But when you're basing how old a planet is on a Bible, I don't think that's sound.
Well, the irony is that the Bible doesn't say how old the planet is.
Well, they extrapolate.
And there's a difference.
Yeah.
The Bible doesn't claim to say how old the planet is. The Bible seems wholly disinterested in that question.
I think that's right. It's not an interesting thing. Like, pragmatically, that doesn't really help me with my relationships with people.
Right.
And my approach to the Bible is very much pragmatic, right? What can I get out of this? What is it trying to teach me that I need to know?
Right. And you're doing that even while you're not entirely sure what it is.
Well, I'm trying to explain that. Like, I don't, like, what is God? And it doesn't matter. If I'm following the teachings, I don't care. And then the standard litmus test when people get worried about me is they're like, was the resurrection real? And I'm like, why does this question come up all the time? I'm like, oh, it's kind of a litmus test. They know which box to put you in depending on what your answer is.
Right, right.
Yeah. So I was like, it doesn't matter for me because I'm going to live like it was. And if it wasn't, and that's your attack on my faith to say, well, Jesus wasn't real, I'm like, doesn't matter. Even if he was a made-up guy, I'm still going to live by those teachings because what else am I going to do? I haven't seen a better plan. I haven't seen a better method. And pragmatically in my life, it's working. But
I love that, and that is pragmatism.
Yeah. I'm strongly pragmatic like that. But the culture shock is just that. Like, I didn't realize the difference in culture on, like, evolution. In Europe, it's wholly accepted.
Yeah. And
I realized here, that's not the case. Yeah. I mean, it's more so recent years, but.
Well, depending on where you are in the States, and even the question of what is evolution, because that's not, so what exactly are we talking about? That's because the higher you get the resolution on that question, more interesting things emerge too. You know, I was just having a debate about that on Twitter with Esther, and it's so now suddenly you have a pragmatic question. Well, what does it matter whether or not evolution is true? See, Americans are good at pragmatism. And so you go into a church and someone who, by virtue of their being raised in the church, who doesn't accept evolution, you might say, well, what does it matter whether or not Jesus was raised? I find his teaching works. And someone would say, what does it matter whether or not evolution is true if what the doctor tells me works for making me healthy, even though the doctor was trained in evolution doesn't matter. It's just the pragmatic ability of the doctor's medicine to cure me.
That would be fine. It's when they're saying that you're wrong because you think that it is true and I'm right because the Bible says I'm right. Then you run into, okay, now we're going to have an argument.
Yeah.
One of us is right. And I don't think it's important for our faith in God which one of us is right. But if you're going to say I'm wrong, I'm going to lay my facts out and say, here's what I'm basing my it's right on. What have you got? And then I'll take a look at both and I'll see if you can change my mind.
Right. I ran into this when I was a missionary in the Dominican Republic, and I had a Haitian who was a translator for me. I was visiting a lot of churches that only knew Creole, and because I was living in the Dominican Republic, I only knew Spanish and I hadn't learned Creole. So I had this guy working with me, and he was a school teacher. And it was one day when I'm driving along the coast, and I realized he's a flat earther. And he even asked me, I told him I was going back to the States for a couple of months, and he asked me if I was going to drive. And it's like, you live on an island. I can't drive to New York from here. And so suddenly I begin to realize he and I, parts of our world overlap, parts of our world do not. Now, what's my burden? Should I stop right then and there and say, hey, before we carry on doing this translating work in these churches where I'm teaching a whole bunch of things to these churches, let me get this flat earth, round earth thing straight right now. I didn't do that.
No.
And, you know, and some people would say, well, he was wrong. And I think, yeah, he's wrong. I'm really very sure we were living on an island, and I'm really very sure the better representation of the world is a globe. But here is this way that we disagree, and what's germane? So again, is the world a space for objects, or is the world a forum for action, and what action is required in that moment? So this right and wrong game is a very interesting one, and again, one which is way more complicated than we kind of grow up assuming in our various different cultures.
Yeah, you discover that in physics, where you start to learn, you pick at a subject a little bit, and you figure something out, and then you realize there's 10 other things you don't know.
Yeah.
And then as you specialize, you realize there's more and more you don't understand. And then eventually you're like, I don't know anything. And I've been at this for years. You get less knowledgeable the more knowledge you gain.
I thought Neil deGrasse Tyson had I referenced it in one of my videos, had a wonderful illustration of that, and that the more you learn, the more you realize is connected to what you have learned that you don't know. So actually it's not the unknown, it's the known unknown that continues to grow exponentially as the known grows, which is a fascinating dynamic. And again, one that you don't know until you continue to learn to know more. You have to have a certain amount of knowledge to begin to realize how great your ignorance really is. And then you still have to live. So what does that mean?
As I'm expanding my ideas of what God is, I've always got, there might be something you don't know that will change everything.
That's right. That's right.
And you're like, well, how attached can I get to my ideas when they might be different in a month's time?
Well, one of my favorite C.S. Lewis quote is that, basically, so he was raised in North Ireland, Church of England. About the age 7 or 8, he decided, oh, this stuff is bunk. So he gives it all up. Then when he's no longer has to go to church, he stops going to church, becomes a rather angry young atheist. And then later on, his comment is, if you really want to stay that way, you'd better be very careful about your reading. Because, and again, it's the more you begin to learn, the more you begin to realize, I had all these assumptions. These were just assumptions that I built basically all along the way. And I assumed they all had these foundations under them that made them sure. And so that I was right about these things and everyone else was wrong about these things. And then I knew more and more, and I began to learn, oh, well, now what? And then stuff happens, like someone cuts you off, and there's a bumper sticker. He might be a bad driver, and you think, well, why should I take Bible advice from a bad driver? And it's not exactly the most, if it said John 3:16, I wouldn't have had to look it up. But Psalm 5:2,
how obscure.
Yes.
I'm like, is this something people put on bumper stickers? I've never seen it before, but I'm kind of new at this.
No, I'm not new at this. I've never seen it before. Jeremiah 27, yeah, there's a whole bunch of Bible verses that you see on bumpers. Psalm 5:2, that one's new to me. So, but then again, I think, Peterson is really helpful in terms of, that's where he starts off maps of meaning in terms of a space of objects or a forum for action. Well, and again, that's American pragmatism, but there's a point at which, okay, so there's all these possibilities. You have to decide what words are going to come out of your mouth, and you have to decide what actions you're going to take. And you start to do these things, and as you described, you begin to go down this road. You begin to realize, I was kind of a selfish jerk before, and I really treated people poorly. But if you had asked me if I treated people poorly, I'd say, no, I don't. But the reason I'd say, no, I didn't, was because mostly pride, because I didn't want to look like a person who treated people poorly, because we don't treat other people well who treat people poorly. I mean, it just goes on and on and on. And so suddenly what you're beginning to realize is you're much more self-aware than you were. And even though some of these Christians, I don't really respect their beliefs about evolution, and the music is kind of wonky, but this Bible that they have, which I can't fully figure out because most of it is anonymous and it's very old, and it's a rather strange library, which is what it is. This is actually helping me. And I'm not really quite sure why. And this God figure that this God would get angry, well, okay. But at the same time, he seemed to be intervening in our life in a really strange way, that each time I kind of go with it, better things happen. Mm-hmm. So what does that mean?
And that was a question I had to ask myself, was, if this is acting as if a God is real, can that God be an interventionist God?
Yeah.
And I'm like, well, the evidence says yes. But my logic would say, no, that can't happen. If it's not something and you're just making it up to follow some rules, then it can't intervene because it would have no power.
Right.
But then you spoke of making decisions, and then I've been down this rabbit hole the last few weeks of like, do we have free will? Or am I just a biological hardware with some emotional software that reacts to a situation to produce a result? And that result would never change because my history, my experience, and my personality would produce the same answer every time this situation came up. So I'm like, am I working in a deterministic way based on everything? Then my entire life's pathed out already.
So why don't I just give up this illusion of imagining that I exist? And when I say I mean this chooser, this decider in the middle of all this biological programming. But then you start to sit back and you say, well, wait a minute, what about the frame? Once I start imagining an interventionist God, well, that is all embedded within a frame of kind of this clockwork universe, which is a deism, which someone wound up and it's going, and then this God comes from outside of it. And well, what does that mean? And then obviously, if you say switch over to, say a frame that C.S. Lewis employed often, well, what if this God is actually more like Tolkien to Frodo? Well, suddenly this mechanistic clockwork deist universe that is actually deeply embedded in the secularism we inhabit. I mean, this game doesn't end.
Luckily, being pragmatic, you're like, well, this is all wonderful, but how does it help me get up in the morning?
That's right.
Like, it doesn't matter. Like, I'm going to make the decisions I make, and if it's deterministic, it's deterministic, and if it's free will, it's free will. But would this situation with the student have played out differently? Could I ever have possibly stuck to my guns and said no? I don't know.
And now I don't know if this is where I should go or not, but you're just a few years into this, because what happens then is, if you're living this way for a lot of years, someone like me, I've been living this way all my life. So then you make decisions and you think, boy, this was because of, you can use providence, synchronicities, all this different language for what we're talking about, similar thing. I think God called me to this in 1980 something. But now in 2010, I look back on this and I have a judgment about it. It was a good thing. So then I think, oh yeah, God was good and providential and everything was cool. Or maybe it didn't turn out much to my liking. And then how do I feel about God? And then can I still trust him? Yeah.
Well, just this summer, there's a friend of ours who lives close by, and she lost her husband very unexpectedly around the time that you had the thing with your sister as well, very similar event. And I was interested to see how does she do this? Like he was kind of young, late 40s, early 50s, and then gone.
Yeah.
And how does that play into God? And to watch her ark, the ark they built, sit there in the chaos, solid. And she trusted in God, saying, God's got a plan. She was 100% in her faith, and it was inspiring to see it. And the amount of unnecessary suffering she caused herself through that course of action was pretty much zero.
Yeah.
There was a lot of suffering.
Yeah.
But the unnecessary suffering was removed. And that, I'm like, even from a secular standpoint, even if she was delusional, look how well it worked.
Yeah.
Because she's come through the other side in a few months and she's rebuilding her life. And it was awe-inspiring to watch.
Yeah. Francis Collins. So I don't know if you know his story at all. Francis Collins, he was, so there are two groups that were unlocking the human genome. Francis Collins was leading one of them. And he wrote a book, The Language of God. So he grew up completely secular. He was a medical doctor in a hospital. And he began to pay attention to patients that had faith and patients that didn't. And a very similar thing to what you just described, he began to note something of patients who had faith, and he began to say, what's with that? And he began to look into it, and that journey led him to becoming a Christian. And, so it led him to the language of God is how he tries to put together the world, which we all have to try to put it together. But it was exactly that thing that he was watching Christians suffer and how they suffered, and thought, there's something going on there. It was a burning bush, and he had to go check it out.
And it's powerful stuff. And I just feel it's so useful for everyone. But that word Jesus scares a lot of people. You just mention it, and you've grown an extra head or something, and people are like, I need to get out of this conversation right now.
Yeah.
And there's such power in that name to this day.
Yeah.
But it's so useful for so many people. And then you get like empowered by it. I want everyone to have this. And it's great. But
you're inviting people to church, just like those people you met on the walk who do this funny thing called church planting, and you're sure you're going to say yes, you're going to go there, it's going to be weird, and you're going to give them money, and that's going to be your way out.
Yeah, but show up and see what happens. If you hate it, I'll give you your money back. But that's what I want to do. But it's God says that's not your job. You don't worry about that. You just don't get in my way. I'll figure the rest out.
That's right.
Because you feel so like it's the guy who found the treasure. I've got the treasure.
That's right. That's right. Yeah. Yeah.
We had a moment in church where they had a speaker who was telling us how the Grand Canyon was formed, X years ago, very recently, by some magic water or whatever.
It was the flood.
And he said that, and the scientists have this conspiracy against the church, and they're trying to destroy it. And my wife, PhD astrophysicist, working in science, she's like, I didn't get this memo. I'm not in on this conspiracy. There's no conspiracy against the church from science.
Well, and again, if I'm trying to get out a video on the hoax papers and some of that discussion. There's history behind that person coming in the frame that they're using. Because the imagination of some people in the church is, well, if we just didn't get into all of this science, then the church would still have the kind of hegemony over the culture that it had once. There's some problems with that. Number one, those golden days weren't really all that golden. The days before, like Charles Taylor said, the belief in God wasn't axiomatic. Just because everybody kind of believed that there was a God certainly didn't mean everybody lived as if Jesus was Lord. I mean, those are two very different things. And most of the people who are complaining bitterly about the havoc science has wreaked, don't complain when they, you know, when their life expectancy is longer and the electricity stays on and they get to ride in airplanes and they get the internet. So, you know,
toothpaste. That's my favorite one for science. You get stripy toothpaste.
Yeah, you get stripy toothpaste.
Greatest scientific move was stripy toothpaste.
Yeah. So it's a really complicated history and story, and people are people. So.
Mm-hmm. So on the culture shock, I think it's if you're coming from a Peterson biblical background, you know, it'd be nice if you're aware that this is something. I was caught completely unawares. I thought people would like, oh, this is a new way of looking at it. This is great. That might not happen.
No.
And there's going to be work on both sides here. So you coming into their culture, you got to acclimate to it, and then just try and get what you can biblically out of it.
And I tell people that. I say, okay, so you're going to a church. If, you know, don't worry about, very much like you said, you know, in most churches, they'll be very happy to have you, even if you say, like Nacho Libre's friend, I believe in science, and, oh, okay. But they're probably still not going to chase you out because they have this other foundational thing that says you should welcome these people. That's also built into the culture. So you will be their local heretic, and part of them will love you for it.
Well, it's a nice thing he said, like the pastor. I said, I'm not a religious person. And he looked at me and he was like, good, nor am I. I thought that got my attention. And he's like, it's a personal relationship, not a religious, like seek Jesus, not religion.
Yeah.
Let's do it this way.
Yeah. But then there was that scary word again, see, you know, because at some point you're going to say, well, what do you mean seek Jesus? Because I can talk to you, I can read about Jesus, but, you know, even this personal relationship language, that's heavily God number two. And the kind of, you know, like a friend of mine who just passed away last year said, you know, God kills grandmas and puppies. That's God number one. And God number one and God number two are the same God. Well, how do I live with that God? And how does that God relate to Jesus? And no, it's something to try to get your head around, and it doesn't quit.
It's a great journey.
It is a great journey.
There's lots of incidents. You get thrown into a lot of situations you're not expecting to be in, and grow constantly through this. So I'm excited for my future, my family's future, see my daughter grow up in this. But we want her to go at her own pace. You know, we don't want to be one of those religious parents who are like, you must believe this, devil child. I'm seeing her getting an awful lot from it, like her attitude towards other people. And like we passed some homeless people in the car, and she's like, you know, someone should help them. And she had her birthday money with her. And I'm like, you could help them. And she's like, okay. I'm like, I'm proud. That's the right thing.
That is the right
It's a race to the bottom. So you see people in need and you're like, okay, what can I do to help you?
Yeah. No, that's beautiful. We have just a few minutes left before the next guy comes in. And so any last minute things you want to say or touch on? I'm sure glad we did this though, because I lately haven't had a lot of time to put out a lot of other videos, but I love these conversations, and I'm so grateful for you for sharing your story with me.
People are so interesting, aren't they?
Oh, yes! Astoundingly interesting.
Just as Peterson said, give someone 10 minutes and you'll have the most incredible story out of them.
That's exactly true. And so not everybody, for very good reason, wants me to post my conversation with them, but this whole, one of the huge gifts that Jordan Peterson has given me is all of you, because I get to hear stories like yours almost every day. And it is so cool. It really is.
It's great. I don't know. When I'm in small groups, I find that if you want to get off the hook, you just have to say, be like Jesus. And that's a nice get out of jail free card if you're ever called on to answer something.
Oh, that's right.
Be like Jesus. You can't go wrong.
And children learn this. If sometimes they have these little children's sermons in front of the church, and the answer to every question that the children will give is Jesus, and it always works. So that's, and again, we joke about that and we laugh about that, but in a Petersonian way, if you start to take that apart, you begin to realize there's something very mysterious and big and powerful going on there that we all too easily don't notice. And we can't actually explain it.
Mm-hmm. And the Jesus story, the resurrection story, appears across cultures and things so many different ways and so many different times. That I'm like, that doesn't weaken it for me. If you can attack Christianity saying it's a copy of this or a copy of that, but if this story keeps showing up, I'm like, I should pay attention to this because it's clearly archetypical in some way and important.
Yeah. Have you read much C.S. Lewis?
No, I have not.
You should probably read some C.S. Lewis on that, because that, for him, that's, people would say, oh, well, there's all these resurrection gods. And C.S. Lewis, he makes this point in the chapter, The Grand Miracle. You can find it on C.S. Lewis Doodles. You can find it in Miracles. You can find it in other compilation books of his, because he actually says it a few different ways. He says, but the really funny thing was, it happened in the one culture in the ancient world that didn't play that game. And that's what's so interesting about it. And so for C.S. Lewis, the thing that Tolkien really got him to think about was, well, what if this, all of these resurrection stories that you have through history, they're all clouded in mythology and they're mythical and they're archetypal. What if it happened? And then suddenly you begin to say, well, what if it happened? And then now that then turns in again on my life. And I say, because a lot of people would say, okay, so this guy cut your wife off, and you look at the Psalm and you read the Psalm, and boy, it's kind of about being open to God. And then boom, that day you get a call, take in an exchange student, and you take in an exchange student. Well, that doesn't make any sense. That's just crazy.
That's what my reason is doing. It's outraged that I would do such a thing.
Right.
And that's my kind of old self trying to keep, I still want to be God.
Yeah.
We can't give it all over to this other guy.
Yeah. And if you are the author of your story isn't going to be anywhere near as good as if you let God be its author, because he's a far better writer. And if you need proof of that, talk to 1,000 people.
Yeah.
Because all of us, the story I write for myself is incredibly dull. The story God writes for me now is including listening to some crazy Canadian psychologist who says, I live as if God is real. Well, I didn't plan on this for my story, but here it is.
Exactly. It's great.
It is great. Well, I'm out of time, and I don't want to shortchange the next guy. So would you like me to post this? Because I'd sure be happy to post it.
I'm perfectly fine with that. If you see value in it, then go ahead.
Oh, because for every conversation I have like this with you in public, I have 5 conversations or emails from people in private. And so I know a lot of people would connect with your story. So.
Okay, then go ahead.
Okay, I think it deserves to be shared. Well,
God can work through me.
He can, and he will, and he isn't going to stop. So thank you so much, Darren.
Thank you too.
And I'm sure we'll touch base at another time.
Keep in touch.
All right. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.